My name is Emma. I was born and raised in the loving embrace of my mother. My father passed away when I was very young, and throughout my childhood, it was just the two of us, relying on each other to survive. My mother worked tirelessly, saving every penny to raise me. I thought my life would always be peaceful until the day she suddenly told me I was getting married. Emma, you're grown up now. It's time to start your own family. Ryan is a good man. He will give you a stable and happy life, my mother said softly, but I could see the firmness in her eyes. I was stunned. I had never met Ryan before, nor had I ever heard my mother mention him. How could this happen so suddenly? I didn't want to marry a stranger, but I couldn't bring myself to disobey my mother. She had sacrificed so much for me. If this was what she wished for, how could I be selfish enough to refuse? The wedding took place amidst cheerful celebrations, but my heart felt heavy. Dressed in a pure white gown, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, struggling to recognize the girl about to step into a life with a stranger. Ryan, my husband, was a tall man with a calm but distant expression. Throughout the ceremony, he barely spoke, responding to congratulations with only a faint smile. When he took my hand to place the ring on my finger, his palm was cold, and I couldn't stop my own hand from trembling. As the music played and applause filled the air, I felt like I was being swept into a whirlwind beyond my control. Everything was happening too fast, blurring the line between reality and a dream. After the reception, I followed Ryan to his home. The house was grand but cold, devoid of the warmth of a family. When we entered the bedroom, a wave of fear washed over me. I sat on the bed, clutching my hands together tightly, my heart pounding with confusion and dread. Meanwhile, Ryan stood by the window, silently gazing out into the night. I waited for words, for a gesture, anything from him. But all I received was a heavy, lingering silence. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes unreadable. "You can sleep. I won't touch you," he said in a low, distant voice. I stared at him in surprise, but he didn't wait for my response. He grabbed a pillow, turned around, and walked out of the room without another word. The door closed with a soft click, leaving me alone in the cold, unfamiliar room. Hugging the blanket tightly, I felt an overwhelming loneliness seep into my soul. Was this the marriage I was destined for? A husband who barely acknowledged me? A bond that felt so distant and foreign? I tossed and turned on the bed, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. Does he hate me? Why didn't he touch me? Is this truly the life my mother wished for me? Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks of the window, carrying a chill that mirrored the cold emptiness in my heart. That night, I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the faint glow of the street lamp beyond the window. Did I make a mistake by entering this marriage? But even if I regretted it, it was far too late to turn back. The first days as Ryan's wife were a blur of silence and monotony. He barely acknowledged my existence, coming home late and leaving early, treating me as though I were invisible. I felt lost and alone, a stranger in this grand but soulless house. But then he appeared, breaking through the icy walls surrounding me. I met Daniel for the first time on a gloomy afternoon. I was in the living room, tidying up, when the front door suddenly creaked open. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. I turned, and there he was. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway, his white shirt clinging to his muscular frame, the top buttons undone, revealing a glimpse of his firm chest. His sharp gaze swept over me, assessing, calculating. Ryan's wife! His lips curled into a faint, dangerous smirk, his deep voice laced with something unreadable. I nodded, my throat dry. "I'm Daniel," he said, stepping closer, the subtle scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Ryan's older brother. He was nothing like Ryan. Where Ryan was cold and distant, a block of ice, Daniel radiated a raw, untamed intensity. Something wild, something dangerous. After that first meeting, I started encountering Daniel more often. One warm afternoon, I was in the garden picking vegetables for dinner. As I bent down, a sudden firm grip closed around my wrist. Startled, I gasped and looked up. Daniel was standing impossibly close, his strong hand holding mine. "You should be more careful." His voice was low, rough, with a flicker of something smoldering in his eyes. "You could hurt yourself." Flustered, I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart pounding so hard I feared he could hear it. Another time, I was walking down the hallway when I suddenly tripped. My eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the painful impact, but it never came. Instead, strong arms caught me, pulling me into a firm embrace. When I opened my eyes, Daniel's face was only inches from mine. His warm breath brushed softly against my skin. "You're so careless, little sister-in-law," he murmured, his voice laced with playful teasing. But his eyes told a different story. They burned through me. I quickly stepped back, putting distance between us. But my heart was no longer under my control. I tried to avoid him after that. I really did. But the more I fled, the deeper I was pulled into the dangerous storm he stirred around me. One night, Ryan didn't come home. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, restless. But then, a soft sound in the hallway. I sat up abruptly, my pulse quickening. I slipped out of bed, cracked the door open. And there he was. Daniel. He stood just beyond the threshold, his gaze darkening the moment it found me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his deep voice low, almost a whisper, as he stepped closer. His eyes, they seemed to devour me whole. I instinctively tried to retreat, but my back met the cold, unyielding wall. His hand rose, palm resting against the wall beside my head, trapping me between his towering frame and the chilled surface behind me. "Emma!" His voice dipped, low and velvety, my name rolling off his tongue with a dangerous warmth. "Don't you feel trapped here?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. What are you saying?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. His face leaned in closer, the space between us vanishing into nothingness. "I'm just saying," he murmured, a fleeting smirk tugging at his lips, though his eyes blazed with something raw and untamed. "It's a shame to watch you waste away here." I should have pushed him away, should have screamed, should have done something to end this reckless, dangerous moment, but I didn't. Because in that breathless, forbidden second, I felt it, the heat, the temptation, the sinful, undeniable pull toward him. I didn't know how long I had been standing outside Daniel's door. My mother-in-law's words still echoed in my mind, but doubt flooded every corner of my heart. The cold surface of the wooden door pressed against my fingertips. Just one push, and I would be facing him again. But then I drew in a deep breath, forcing down the chaos swirling inside me and knocked. "Come in." His voice, deep and rough, carried no trace of emotion. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately feeling the heavy tension that clung to the room. The space was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The golden light carved sharp shadows along Daniel's chiseled face. He sat back in a leather chair, one hand resting lazily on the desk. His white shirt hung open at the collar, a few buttons undone, revealing sun-kissed skin taut with strength. Thin ribbons of smoke curled through the air, the lingering scent of a cigarette, thick and heady, wrapping the room in a haze as tangled as the thoughts in my mind. I swallowed hard, struggling to steady my breath. "Here's your tea." I placed the tray on the table, intending to leave immediately, but as I turned away, "Emma!" His voice stopped me cold. I froze. Slowly, I turned back and met his gaze. It held me, trapped me, deep, intense, dangerous. "You're Ryan's wife." His voice was low, each word a quiet warning. "Don't cross the line." My heart clenched. I bit my lip, dropping my gaze. I needed to leave. I should leave. Fingers curled into fists at my sides, I fought the storm inside me and moved quickly toward the door. But just as my hand brushed the cold brass handle, bang! My body was yanked back, my back hitting the solid wood with a dull thud. Before I could catch my breath, his hands were on my shoulders, firm, unyielding, caging me between his body and the cold, unrelenting door. His breath, hot and burning, brushed against my skin, every inch of space between us erased. "Then tell me," his voice rough and low, edged with something dark and dangerous. "Why did you come here?" I felt a strange sensation as Daniel pulled me closer. My whole body trembled, unable to face him, but his gaze was like an irresistible force, keeping me from escaping. I just brought tea as my mother asked," I said, my voice trembling, but Daniel didn't let me escape the tension. "You're lying," he replied, his voice hoarse, cold, yet it carried a strength that was almost haunting. His hand tightened around me, and I felt the warmth of his palm pressing through the thin fabric of my clothes, like a warning of the growing tension. Everything around me seemed to go still, leaving only the sound of our breaths merging together, tangled with the irregular beats of my heart. "Emma, look me in the eye," Daniel commanded, but I couldn't do it. I didn't want to face him, didn't want to look into his eyes, which held things I wasn't ready to understand. I shook my head, wanting to avoid it, but he wouldn't give me the chance. He leaned in closer, almost so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. His hand tightened around my waist, pulling me even closer, and all my thoughts seemed to vanish. "Why don't you push me away?" His question was like a knife to my heart. I stood there, unable to answer, unable to react. I could have pushed him away. I could have screamed. I could have run. But I did nothing. I just stood there, motionless, consumed by his gaze, ensnared by the temptation surrounding me. My body seemed frozen, as though an invisible force kept me in that moment. Daniel chuckled, a low, raspy laugh, as if he knew I couldn't leave. "If you don't, I won't take responsibility." His words echoed, and before I could react, I felt a strong pull. His body pressed into mine, and I couldn't breathe, my eyes wide open, but before I could do anything, his lips met mine. 1 second, 2 seconds. And like a small spark in the dark, it ignited, burning all the remaining reason I had left. My body stiffened, unable to resist, unable to think. All that was left was the heat, the strange feeling between temptation and fear. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, my mind was blank. I didn't know if I had pushed him away or if I had resisted. All I knew was, in that moment, I had truly crossed the fragile boundary. Then suddenly, creak! The door to the room swung open. I startled, pushing Daniel away forcefully, spinning around. At the doorway, Ryan stood there. He looked at me, his eyes darkening. I froze. The storm had truly just begun. We returned to our room. Ryan took off his shirt in front of me, revealing ugly scars. His voice trembled. "I kept my distance because I didn't want you to be afraid." Tears burst from my eyes. It turned out I had judged him too quickly. I looked up at Ryan, his eyes still tinged with sorrow, but there seemed to be a sense of relief as I didn't back away. "Emma!" He softly called my name, as if wanting to confirm that I was still here, still accepting him. I gripped his hand, feeling the warmth and the tremor in his fingertips. He looked at me, his eyes seeming deeper than ever. But just at that moment, creak! The door swung open. I jumped, turning back. Daniel stood there. His shadow stretched long under the hallway light, his eyes darkening when he saw Ryan and me in each other's arms. A silence stretched painfully, suffocating. Then Daniel smirked, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Quite affectionate, huh?" His voice carried a mocking tone, but his gaze was icy. I quickly pulled away from Ryan, my heart racing uncontrollably. But Ryan didn't let go of my hand. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" Ryan's voice deepened, a note of caution creeping in. "I was just passing by, saw the door wasn't closed, so I got curious," Daniel shrugged, but his gaze remained fixed on me. I swallowed hard, trying to avoid his stare. "Well, you can leave now," Ryan said, his voice growing firmer. Daniel chuckled softly, but made no move to leave. "Brother, do you really think Emma understands you?" I froze. Ryan narrowed his eyes, his tone turning cold. "What do you mean by that?" Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes sharp as if trying to tear through Ryan's facade. "Did you tell Emma about our father?" Daniel smirked. "But did you tell her everything? Did you tell her about the night he died?" I turned to look at Ryan in shock. His father died. Ryan's expression darkened. I felt his hand tighten around mine, as if that was the only way for him to hold himself together. "Daniel, shut up!" But Daniel didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. "Emma, did you know?" He tilted his head at me, a mocking smile curving his lips. "Our father didn't die from illness or an accident." My heart constricted. Ryan clenched his fist tightly. "That's enough, Daniel." But Daniel had already let out his final words. He died by Ryan's hand. I was stunned. The entire room seemed to freeze. The wind outside howled through the window crack, bringing with it a sharp, icy chill. I turned to look at Ryan, but he didn't deny it. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with emotions I couldn't quite decipher. I took a step back. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did you kill your father?" Ryan clenched both of his fists, his nails digging into his flesh. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want you to know about this." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought I understood him. I thought I had entered his world. But it turned out I was still just standing at the door of a much darker secret. I didn't know how to face this truth. I didn't know if I had the courage to accept the man standing in front of me anymore, because the man I called my husband might be a murderer. The air in the room thickened, as if it could suffocate me at any moment. I stepped back, my gaze fixed on Ryan. He didn't say a word to deny it, not a single word. My entire world seemed to collapse. The man I thought I was starting to understand turned out to carry such a horrifying secret within him. I could feel my heartbeat pounding against my chest. A part of me wanted to run out of this room, to distance myself from Ryan, from everything. But another part of me couldn't move, as if his deep, painful gaze had pinned me to the spot. "Emma!" Ryan's voice was hoarse as he spoke, his tone heavy with emotion. "I can explain." Explain? How could anyone explain a murder? I opened my mouth about to say something, but Daniel chuckled softly, interrupting the tense silence. "Oh, how interesting. Do you really think she'll believe you?" Ryan whipped around to face Daniel, his eyes icy enough to make me feel afraid. "Shut your mouth," Daniel shrugged, but I could see a glimmer of amusement flicker in his eyes. "You can tell me to be quiet, but the truth is still the truth, right?" He smirked. "You killed him, and now you can't hide from it anymore." I turned to look at Ryan, waiting for his answer. This time, he didn't stay silent. Ryan took a deep breath, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "My father was a monster." His voice dropped, as though recounting a nightmare he had tried to bury for too long. "Since I was a child, he beat my mother mercilessly. Every night I heard her crying, screaming echoes through this dark house." I shuddered. Growing up in that, I promised myself that one day I would protect her. Ryan closed his eyes, as if trying to push back the terrifying memories. "But I was too weak. I could only hide under the table, gripping my hands until they bled, too scared to step out." I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm. "One night, it all went too far." His voice cracked, thick with pain. "I came home late and saw my mother lying on the floor, blood everywhere. My father stood there, holding a belt, his breathing ragged like a wild animal." I gasped, my hand instinctively moving to cover my mouth, trying to stifle the gasp. "He turned to look at me," Ryan continued, his eyes hollow, as if lost in the memory. "And he said, 'You're useless, you couldn't protect your mother.'" Anger surged in his voice. At that moment, I couldn't think anymore. I charged at him, grabbed the knife on the table and... Ryan stopped speaking. I held my breath. He clenched his fist so tightly that the scars on his hands stood out clearly in the dim light. I don't remember exactly what I did. I just know that when I came to my senses, he was lying there, blood spilling from his chest. I don't know when I stopped breathing. The room was enveloped in silence. Ryan looked up at me, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Pain, guilt, and fear. "The truth is, I killed him, Emma." I staggered back. Not because I feared Ryan would hurt me, but because I didn't know how to face this. "Emma," he called my name, his voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to understand it wasn't murder. It was self-defense." I stared at him, my heart in turmoil. Could I believe him? Could I believe that this was just self-defense? Or was I standing next to a real murderer? I didn't know how long it took to break free from the shock. When I left the room, my heart was still pounding erratically. Stepping into the dark hallway, I felt like I was drifting through a dream or a nightmare. "How does it feel?" I jumped, startled. Daniel was leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets, a half smile playing on his lips as he looked at me. "What do you mean?" I tried to keep my voice steady. Daniel moved closer, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite read. "Now you know the truth about Ryan. Are you sure you still want to stay with him?" I froze. I knew Daniel was trying to plant doubts in my mind. "He's just defending himself," I replied, my voice growing quieter. Daniel chuckled softly. "Have you ever wondered? What if one day he loses control? What if the person in front of him then isn't his father, but you?" Daniel's words pierced through me like a knife. I couldn't respond. Daniel tilted his head, staring at me for a long moment before whispering, "Emma, do you really think he's different from our father?" I stiffened. Daniel laughed softly, turned, and walked away, leaving me standing still in the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there. All I knew was that Daniel's question kept haunting me. Could I trust Ryan, or was I putting myself in a danger I didn't realize? I couldn't sleep. All night, my mind spun with questions that had no answers. Everything in my life before seemed to fade, like it was breaking into tiny fragments. Ryan, his father, Daniel. I tried to keep my composure, but the harder I tried, the deeper I felt myself sinking into an endless abyss. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, pulling me out of my chaotic thoughts. I got up and opened the door. Ryan was standing there, his tall figure casting a long shadow on the floor. His eyes were tired, but there was something deep in them, like a silent plea he couldn't express. "You're not asleep yet." His voice was hoarse, a hint of worry in it. I shook my head, unable to speak. "Ryan ... I choked out. "Did you really kill your father?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. He looked at me as if deciding whether he should continue or not. Finally, he sighed, stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. I already told you, Emma. It was self-defense. I didn't want to kill him." His voice was weak, but filled with determination. "I just wanted to protect my mother, protect myself." I felt a lump in my throat, but I still tried to stay calm. "Ryan, what if it wasn't self-defense? What if you did it for other reasons?" I couldn't hold my emotions any longer. My voice began to tremble. He was silent for a long time, his eyes seeming to hide something much bigger, much more terrifying. "I can't tell you everything right now, Emma." He lowered his head, his hand clenched into a fist. There are things I can't let you know. Not because I don't trust you, but because if you knew, you would never look at me the same way again." I took his hand, my heart aching. "Ryan, I want to understand. I want to help you, but I can't just stand here and listen to these explanations. What really happened?" After a long pause, he finally looked up, his eyes seemingly staring into a deep abyss. "Emma, Daniel was only partially right about what he told you, but not everything." "What? What does Daniel know about your father?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. Ryan stepped closer to me, his eyes filled with pain. "He knew that my father had an affair with another woman, and he did terrible things to cover it up. But Daniel doesn't know what I did to protect him, to protect my mother." I was stunned, unable to say a word. "What did you do?" I whispered, my eyes wide with fear. Ryan looked at me, pain flashing in his eyes. "Daniel thinks I killed our father out of anger, but the truth is, I killed him to protect him." It felt like the world was awakening, but everything became even more confused. "Daniel didn't know that our father had tried to kill him," Ryan said, each word laced with guilt. "Because Daniel was the only one left in the family, he wanted to get rid of him, to take everything for himself. Daniel had no idea about this. He just sees me as a murderer." I stepped back, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Ryan, if you didn't kill him, then what?" I tried to keep my voice steady. Ryan hesitated. "I wouldn't let Daniel die. I couldn't let him become a victim of our own father. That's something I couldn't let happen." Once again, I felt like I was falling into an abyss, unable to escape. So, everything wasn't as I thought. Ryan wasn't a murderer. He was the only one who could save Daniel from the death their father had planned for him. But did Daniel know this truth? Suddenly, I remembered Daniel's words from the night before. He said I would never look at Ryan the same way if I knew the truth. But could it be that Daniel knew all along? "Emma," Ryan gently took my hand, his eyes filled with worry. "I don't want you to carry all of this. I just want you to have peace, to live happily. But if you can't live with this truth—" He paused, as if afraid to say the rest. I looked at him, not knowing what to do. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't back away now. Even if I had to step into the darkness, even if I had to face all the truths, I wouldn't leave Ryan. But the one question I couldn't answer was, could I trust Daniel? And could I trust Ryan? Tonight, I couldn't stop thinking about everything Ryan had just shared. The whole room seemed suffocating, the silence thickening around me. Each of my breaths felt like it was breaking the stillness. Ryan stood there, his eyes filled with sorrow, but I couldn't look at him with the same calmness as before. The secrets had been revealed, but they didn't ease the doubts inside me. Daniel had said that I wouldn't look at Ryan the same way if I knew the truth. And now I was standing at a crossroads, unsure of what to do. Ryan must have sensed my unease, but he said nothing. We stood there in silence, and the air between us felt thick and heavy. After a while, Ryan spoke. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, I just want you to understand." His voice was soft, but I could feel the desperation in every word. I looked at him, my eyes empty. "I don't know, everything is just too complicated." Ryan took a step closer to me, stopping when there were only a few steps between us. He reached out, gently placing his hand on my shoulder. Emma, you don't have to do anything right now. I just want you to know one thing. You're the most important person to me. I stayed silent. His words were so sweet, but they couldn't erase the wounds in my heart. Then there was a knock at the door, breaking the quiet of the room. Ryan, are you in there? Daniel's voice came from outside. Ryan looked at me for a moment, then gently stepped back. Do you want to see him? I couldn't say anything. I just shook my head. But no matter how much I shook my head, I knew I couldn't avoid this confrontation. Ryan stepped out, leaving me alone in the still room. The sound of his footsteps grew fainter until all that remained was the silence. I sat down on the bed, my hands clutching each other, feeling helpless as if I were being sucked into a vortex. How could I live with these secrets? How could I keep facing Ryan, facing Daniel, when everything inside me was falling apart? After a moment, the door opened and Daniel stepped inside. He didn't speak, just looked at me with cold eyes, as if waiting for my reaction. Are you okay? Daniel asked, his voice soft but laced with challenge. I looked at him, not knowing how to respond. Daniel, what do you want? I sighed, feeling trapped in a snare with no way out. He smiled, a smile full of hidden meaning. I just want you to understand one thing. Ryan isn't a good person, Emma. He's just using you. Don't you see it? My heart felt like it was being squeezed, but I couldn't let Daniel see my doubt. I don't believe you. Daniel stepped closer, standing face to face with me. Why not? Because you think he loves you? He raised an eyebrow, then continued. He's just hiding the truth from you, Emma. If you knew everything he's done, you wouldn't have the strength to love him anymore. I swallowed hard, not daring to look him in the eye. Daniel had said too much, and every word was like a dagger to my heart. He killed his father, Emma. He'd kill others if he could. This whole family has blood on their hands. Daniel was blunt, but his gaze was devoid of humanity. I felt my world shatter, but I knew I couldn't stand there in silence. I won't believe you. I won't believe anyone but Ryan. I said it firmly, though my heart was a mess. Daniel smirked, his expression cold. It's your choice, but you'll regret it when you know the whole truth. He turned and left the room without looking back, leaving me with a flood of questions swirling in my mind. Ryan. Is he really the person I thought he was? Daniel's words echoed in my head, like ghosts haunting me that I couldn't shake. I didn't know whether I should trust Ryan or retreat to protect myself, but one thing I knew for sure, I couldn't leave him. Despite everything, I couldn't leave him. All night long, I couldn't sleep. Daniel's words were like a wave that washed away all logic, while Ryan's words were a comforting stream. But I still couldn't escape the unanswered questions. Daniel said I would regret it, but could I live a lifetime with doubt? The next morning, I woke up feeling like all my energy had been drained. The weak light filtering through the curtains touched my hand, but it couldn't melt the darkness inside me. I stood up, removed my pajamas, and walked to the window. Outside, the city was bustling, but I felt like a boat lost at sea, not knowing where the shore was. What Ryan had shared with me last night still lingered in my mind. His father's death, self-defense, and then Daniel. He wanted me to believe a different story. I turned, looking toward the door. Suddenly, I heard a gentle knock. Emma, are you in there? Ryan. His voice was warm, but there was a hint of worry in it. I didn't respond immediately. Honestly, I still didn't know how to face him after everything I had just heard. But I knew if I didn't open the door, I wouldn't be able to live in silence for long. I slowly walked toward the door and gently turned the handle. Ryan stood there, looking at me with eyes full of patience and expectation. He wore a simple shirt, but the weariness in his eyes couldn't be hidden. He didn't speak right away, standing still as if giving me time to decide. I couldn't sleep, I spoke first, my voice soft, but there was no hiding the worry in it. Ryan nodded. I know. I'm sorry, Emma. I never wanted you to face all this. He emphasized every word, as if making sure I understood that he didn't want me to endure this. I looked at him, my gaze still full of unease. Couldn't you have not told me all of this? Ryan looked surprised, his eyes reflecting pain. You want me to hide everything from you? I shook my head. It's not that I want you to hide it. I just don't know who to believe. Ryan fell silent, then slowly stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He stood there, facing me, Emma, I can't change my past, but I want you to know that I'm not the person Daniel is trying to paint me as. I don't want you to suffer. I don't want you to live in fear. I just want you to feel safe. I looked at him, my hands suddenly trembling. I can't live in doubt, Ryan. I can't. But if you're telling the truth, I'll have to face it. I don't know if I can do that. Ryan stepped closer to me, his eyes serious and heavy with emotion. He lifted my chin, as if searching for truth in my eyes. I only love you, Emma. Everything I've done for you and the ones I love. But if you can't trust me, I won't force you to. A moment of silence engulfed the room. Everything around us seemed to blur. My hands were still shaking, but the feeling inside me was very clear. I loved Ryan. I couldn't keep living in doubt, and if I had to face the truth, I would, because I trusted him. I took a deep breath, then gently placed my hand on his. I trust you, Ryan. I can't see you as a bad person. No matter what you've done, I still believe you had your reasons. Ryan looked at me, his eyes filled with emotion. He bent down and kissed my forehead softly. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for trusting me. But I couldn't shake the question in my mind. Would this trust be enough to face whatever was to come? Could my relationship with Ryan continue peacefully as it once had? Or would I face storms I hadn't yet imagined? It felt like everything was starting over. Ryan was no longer a stranger to me. He was no longer someone who only brought coldness and silence. Slowly, he opened up, sharing things he had never revealed before. The scars on his body were no longer just reminders of inner battles, but explanations for the years of silence. We started talking more, not just small talk, but deep conversations from the heart. Ryan told me about his childhood, the times he had to face the absence of his father, the lonely nights when no one understood him. Every time he shared, I felt like a stone in my heart was being lifted. I listened, not just with my ears, but with my heart. Back then, I always thought I would never be loved. My father abandoned me when I was very young. My mother was too weak to give me the warm hug a child needs. Ryan sighed, his eyes filled with sorrow. So I built my own world. I didn't need anyone. I didn't need love. I sat beside him, gently stroking his hair. I understand. I understand you more than I understand myself. He looked up, his eyes full of sincerity. Emma, if it weren't for you, I might never have dared to face that pain. You are the only light in my darkness. A warm feeling spread through me. I never thought that one day we would share so much. In the past months, I had always doubted and feared, but now all those feelings had slowly faded, making room for empathy and love. As time passed, I began to care for Ryan in my own way, not just with meals or medicine, but with small gestures, soft words, making him feel that someone was always by his side. He gradually recovered, not just physically, but emotionally as well. His eyes would light up every time I cared for him, and I realized our love was slowly being revived. One evening, as we sat together on the sofa, the soft light shining on Ryan's face, he turned to me, taking my hand. Emma. His voice was gentle but full of sincerity. Thank you for staying. You don't know how scared I was when I thought you would leave me, but you stayed, and you gave me the strength to face everything. I looked at him, my eyes full of affection. I will always be here, Ryan. No matter what happens, I will never leave you. A soft smile appeared on Ryan's lips, a smile I had never seen before, a smile filled with peace and happiness. We sat there, hand in hand, without needing to say anything else. The whole world outside seemed distant. Only the two of us, in that moment, were enough. Our love had been revived, no matter how painful the past was. Ryan had found his light in me, and I had found a part of myself in him. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I had decided to walk it with Ryan. No matter how many challenges there were, our love would be the guiding light, helping us overcome everything. That morning, the sunlight poured into the small room, bringing a sense of peace I had never felt before. Everything around us seemed still, like a promise of the peace Ryan and I had built together. But peace is not always permanent. The door suddenly opened and I froze when I saw Daniel. He stood there, not in a hurry, but with a cold, unreadable gaze. His hair hung down, his face full of restraint. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to read my reaction. Daniel, why are you here? I asked, my voice slightly trembling. It wasn't that I was afraid of him, but the tension in the air made it hard for me to stay calm. Daniel didn't answer immediately, but walked in and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, as if unsure of where to begin. The air between us was heavy with unspoken meaning. I could sense that this meeting wasn't going to be ordinary. "Emma, I just want to say goodbye," Daniel spoke, his voice low and deep. He looked at me with an intense, meaningful gaze. "I don't want you to think that I'm doing this for personal gain, but I have to leave. I can't stay here forever, whether for you or for Ryan." I looked at him, unable to hide my confusion. "Where are you going?" Daniel was silent for a moment, then smiled faintly, though there was no joy in his expression. "I'm going to leave everything behind, but before I go, I want you to understand something. I don't regret what I've done. I only regret that you've had to endure so much. Ryan is not the man you think he is, Emma." His words were like a warning, once again planting doubt in my heart. But I couldn't allow myself to doubt any further. I had decided to trust Ryan, and I couldn't go back now. I looked at Daniel resolutely. "You don't understand, Daniel. I've chosen to trust Ryan. He's the one I love," I replied, my voice firmer than ever. Daniel shook his head, his eyes seeming to hold something back, something he hadn't fully let go of. "Emma, if you knew the whole truth, you would never look at Ryan the same way again." Before I could respond, Ryan walked into the room. His voice was calm but firm. "I trust my wife. Don't use our past to be an obstacle for our future. Let the past rest." Ryan didn't look at Daniel, only focused on me. He stepped closer, his eyes unwavering, full of protection and love. Daniel stood still, his eyes full of regret. He must have known that he couldn't change my decision. "I don't want you to suffer anymore, Emma," Daniel said, but his words grew weak and faded as he faced Ryan. I can't let everything be hidden like this." Ryan turned to look at Daniel one last time, his gaze full of challenge. "You can't change anything. That's the truth you have to accept. Let our past stay where it belongs." A moment of silence passed. Daniel looked at me once more, then walked toward the door. His gaze couldn't hide his regret. "Wish you happiness, Emma," he whispered and walked out, closing the door behind him. As the door closed, the room suddenly became silent, but I knew everything was over. Daniel was gone, and he wouldn't be coming back. For me, what remained was what Ryan and I would build from this moment on. Ryan walked up to me, gently wrapping me in his arms. "I know you're hurting, but I'm here, and I will never leave you." I couldn't say anything more, just held him tightly. We stood there, in each other's embrace, as if everything that had passed no longer mattered. In the end, the past had released us, and now only the future mattered. After all the storms, I sat beside Ryan, quietly looking into his eyes. Time couldn't erase the memories of the past, but it taught me how to accept, love, and find peace through understanding. I had endured enough pain, enough confusion, and enough doubt. Daniel, with his cryptic words and advice, had forced me to face things I had never dared to confront. But in the end, I realized that true love isn't about perfection. It's about understanding, accepting the wounds, and healing together. Love is patience and loyalty, as both people face challenges together and learn to love each other more with every passing day. Ryan isn't perfect, but in his flaws and pain, I found a resonance that I had never found in anyone else. He's not just my husband, but the friend, the companion I had been searching for my entire life. "Ryan, you are the man I chose," I said, my voice full of certainty. "And I know I chose right." Ryan looked at me, his eyes shining with emotion and love. He hugged me tightly, as if he never wanted to let go, as if just having me by his side was all he needed. "I chose you too, Emma. I chose you the first time we met, even though I didn't realize it then. You are the reason I kept going, the source of strength that helped me overcome everything." We didn't need to say anything more, no more explanations were necessary. What we shared was a wordless understanding, a love without regret. Today, we had each other, and I believed that no matter what challenges tomorrow brought, we would overcome them. Together.